Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We are in Mark chapter 6. We're going to be starting verse 49 this lesson when we see where Jesus is walking on the water to the disciples out on the Sea of Galilee. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, we see that Jesus in verse 48, it says, and he saw them toiling in rowing, for the wind was contrary to them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he comes to them walking upon the sea, and it says, and he would have passed by them. But I don't really believe it means that. I think the Greek brings out that it means that he went there to draw close to them and to help them in their time of need. So Jesus here walks out on the Sea of Galilee. Now remember, it's the fourth watch, which means that it's between approximately 3 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's at the darkest time of the night. So Jesus now comes out walking on the water to the disciples. The wind is blowing and the waves, it doesn't say it was raining, but the wind was blowing and the waves were tough, and they were having a hard time rowing that boat across the Sea of Galilee. They were struggling pretty well. So now we get into verse 49, and it says here, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it had been a spirit, and they cried out, for they all saw him, and they were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and said unto them, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Now, it says here in verse 48, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it had been a spirit, a spirit. Now, this Greek word for spirit is phantasma, phantasma. And this Greek word means a phantom or an apparition. Now, you're in a boat with other people, it's pitch black out, the wind is blowing and the waves are coming, and a lot of times you can't, I don't even know if they even had little lights, lights on their lanterns or something on the boat. But if they didn't have any kind of lighting on the boat at all, then candles or whatever, they were getting hit by waves, and they didn't even know the waves were coming from which side. And so it was tough for them. And now they see Jesus coming out on the water, but they don't know it's Jesus. They think it's a spirit. They think it's a phantasma. Now, the disciples thought, we have to understand how this Greek word was used back then. And the disciples thought that they were looking at some kind of evil spirit, or they were looking at the spirit of a dead person. Now you may say, how can they do that? Well, that's what this Greek word means in context. This is how they used it back then. They thought that some evil spirit was walking out to them, or some spirit of a dead person was walking out to them on the sea. Now, because it was dark and because they were afraid, their minds were conditioned to misinterpret Jesus as an apparition. So here comes Jesus walking out. Now, I don't know if he was glowing or whatever. He probably, my guess is, even if you're wearing white robes in the pitch black, it's still kind of hard to see. Now, how close Jesus was when he talked to them, we don't know. But it was far enough for Peter to walk out to him, right? It could have been 10 feet. It could have been 100 feet. Is it possible that when Jesus walked out, that he kind of, illuminated himself and, walked out to them so that they could see him afar? We don't know. And the Bible doesn't say. So my guess is that everything was the same. Jesus didn't, snap his fingers and all of a sudden a glow started coming from his clothes, so that he could, it's like those kids have those glow sticks, right? You buy them in the store. You can use them as wristbands, usually for birthday parties or neck things, right? And you take them and they're a stick and then you break them, right? And then they start glowing and they last for several hours, right? But, did Jesus all of a sudden make himself illuminate? My guess is probably no. Maybe it was, maybe there was some kind of moonlight or whatever out there going on, that would illuminate him so that they could see him coming. But anyways, they saw this thing coming to them on the water. They thought it was a spirit. And they misinterpreted Jesus as some kind of apparition, as some kind of phantom. Now, there are times when circumstances in our life can cause us to see everything around us in the negative sense. A blessing or a provision that is sent from God, but it is seen but we see it as something bad, right? Or we see it as something that will hurt us. Sometimes we're in difficult circumstances and all of a sudden, like, God sends a blessing to us. But because we're in that circumstance, we misinterpret the blessing as something that's going to hurt or something that's going to, cause great fear in our hearts. That's something bad for us. But it's only when we hear the voice, when we hear his voice, God's voice, through his word or through a preacher or through a friend, a Christian friend, that comes to us. When we hear the voice of God through these people, or when we hear the voice of God through his word, when we read it, right? And it says what? It is I. It is I. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I know you're in this turmoil, and I know circumstances are dark and bleak, but I'm here. It's me. Don't think of me as some kind of evil thing or some kind of extra thing that's going to make you hurt or make this situation bad. I'm here not to make the situation worse. I'm here to help you in the situation. Right? Then when we hear his voice, it is I, don't be afraid. Then we recognize that it is his voice. It's the voice of God. And we sense God's love and God's care. And our troubled hearts are now turned into good cheer. What does he say in verse 50? For they all saw him and they were troubled. And immediately he talked unto them and he said unto them, be of good cheer, right? It is I, don't be afraid. In the midst of our circumstances, in the midst of our trials and things, we need to hear the voice of God. And it's not always easy because our sinful flesh and the weakness of our flesh, and because of our weak humanity, we have a tendency to want to misinterpret things that come to us, even blessings from God, when we're in difficult situations. But we hear the voice of God and it says, it's me, it's mine. I'm here with you. I'm here with you. And don't be afraid. And then we recognize his voice and we say, we are of good cheer, right? We are of good cheer. Now, as I said at the beginning of this series of messages in the Gospel of Mark, that Mark's Gospel was greatly influenced by Peter because Mark spent a lot of time with Peter in Babylon. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, all right? John Mark spends a lot of time with Peter in Babylon. Therefore, it is funny to me that John Mark and Peter completely leaves out the very next event that happens in this story, which is when Peter walks on the water. All right? Mark does not include Peter walking on the water at all. All right? Now, walking on the water is something that no one would ever forget. All right? If it ever happened to us where we walked on water, I'm telling you, you would never forget it. The rest of your life, you would remember this thing. If you lived to be 110, you'd remember that you walked on water, right? Therefore, it may be that Peter was a little bit embarrassed about losing faith and sinking in the water, right? Why is it that John Mark doesn't mention it? Is it because he didn't know about it? Maybe he did know about it, right? Maybe when Peter walked on the water and began to sink, maybe that was an embarrassing time for him, right? Maybe that was an embarrassing time for him to walk out on the water and then all of a sudden lose faith and sink into the water. And he didn't want it mentioned in the Word of God. In John Mark's gospel, right? Or it may be that he was now humbled and wanted to keep focus on Jesus and not any attention on himself. All right? So Peter walking on the water is an event that, trust me, Peter didn't just, when Peter was explaining to John Mark about this time when Jesus, came out and walked on the water, Peter knew full well what happened. And John Mark, he just doesn't mention it at all. Now, whether it was because Peter was a little bit sensitive to it, and again, maybe he was embarrassed, and maybe the other disciples kind of ribbed him a little bit. You failed, you sunk in the water. Hey, I know they're disciples, but they're human too. Come on, they're human too. They can laugh and joke at Peter. Was it because of that? Or was it because maybe Peter wanted to have the focus put on Christ walking on the water and not on himself? Now, we don't know, but John Mark leaves that out. So, in order to go over this portion of Scripture, we're going to go to the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Matthew does include it in his Gospel, and it's in Matthew chapter 14 and verses 28 to 32. Verses 28 to 32. And we're going to continue on in this lesson here for a little bit. We're going to begin this portion where Peter starts walking on the water, all right? So Matthew 14:28. And it says, and Peter, verse 27 says, but straightway Jesus spoke to them and said, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Now, verse 28 says, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be you, then bid me to come to thee on the water. If it's you, let me come to you on the water. And we're going to finish this lesson in this verse. And, regardless of whether you think Peter was impulsive or whether he was proud or brash, this statement, when he said, bid me come to thee, just tell me to come to you, that statement was a great statement for Peter to make. So when we think of Jesus is walking on the water out to the disciples, the wind is blowing, the waves are coming up, and they're having a hard time, and he says, be of good cheer. It's I, be not afraid, right? Peter says, bid me come to thee, right? Listen, whether you think Peter was proud or brash or whatever, that was an amazing statement for Peter to make. Yes, Peter was human just like us, but he knew enough about the situation that he was in that unless Jesus gave permission to Peter to walk on the water, that he was not going. Peter was not going to go out onto that water unless Jesus gave him permission to come out on the water. Now, he knew that the ability to walk on the water was not in himself. It was only in Jesus. Jesus comes to us walking on our unstable sea of life. And we long within us to be in a position of victory over the circumstances that are around us. We want to be where Jesus is. But we know that it is only by his power and his grace. We are in a boat in the sea of life, and there's all kinds of havoc going around us. There's sin and murders and drugs and rapes and all these things going on all around us. And it's a mess out there. And we see Jesus coming out on our sea of life, on the turmoil of our sea of life, walking out to us, and he's in a position of authority on our sea of life. And we want to be with him. We want to be with him. I want to be where you are, Jesus. I don't like the situation I'm in, but I like the situation you're in. I want to have that kind of victory over the circumstances of my life, that they don't affect me like they are when we are in the boat, right? Do not presume to walk out into your troubled sea unless you are bidden by the Lord. Unless the Lord bids you to come out, don't walk out on this troubled sea of life. Honor the Lord by asking him first. This is a tremendous statement that Peter made that we all need to learn from. If God gives us permission, then he will fully support us. Bid me to come to thee, right? Lord, if you say the word, I know I can come to you, right? But don't go out. Don't step out that boat unless he bids you to come. All right, we're going to continue on in verse 29 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.